Alright guys, how's it going? So a little bit later than I had hoped with this video, I'm going to talk a bit about Intel now, and they're a company that I don't talk an awful lot about. I find it very difficult to get excited about anything Intel does, especially, obviously, on the CPU front. So anything exciting about Intel is mostly when things are looking down, and recently, things have really started looking down for them. It became obvious at some point last year that Intel wasn't really going anywhere fast. They'd been having a lot of issues with their 14nm process, struggling to match the yields that they'd had on previous processes, and the PC market has been retreating for many years now. And it was March last year when we finally got confirmation. Their famous tick-tock strategy, that would be where Intel would introduce a new process. For example, here would be 14nm when they introduced Broadwell. And then, the year afterwards, they would introduce their talk, which would be a new architecture, for example, Skylake. So this is the way Intel had done it for many, many years. The previous architecture was, of course, Haswell, and the previous tick to that would of course have been Ivy Bridge. But this was thrown out the window with Kaby Lake, and it would now be process architecture optimization. The big change of course being that optimization would continue to be on the same process. This is all about the difficulty in shrinking a process. Intel managed to keep to this tick-tock for years. There were maybe one or two slips by a month or two, but generally speaking, they did manage to change their process every couple of years. Now though, with all the problems at 14nm and the difficulty in shrinking even further, Kaby Lake effectively being nothing more than an overclocked, slightly optimised Skylake. And it was really no great surprise when we learned 1 month later that they were cutting 12,000 jobs. That was 11% of Intel's total workforce got the chop last year. Now this is one of the things about Intel. They're very good at reacting before it becomes a massive problem, and normally they react by chopping their staff, like any true company would. So 12,000 got laid off last year, and people started to take notice that Intel was a company that was not in great health. An awful lot of people assume that Intel are doing great because their revenue continues to rise, but there's a bit more to it than that. And I always felt that the scenario they found themselves in, which is basically an x86 monopoly, with that monopoly in place, they just didn't grow enough, and they also have a propensity for making bad acquisitions. They spent a huge amount of money on utter crap like McAfee, $8 billion on McAfee, and what was it, $15 billion on Altera? That's a lot of money. And they've also wasted billions of dollars trying to crack the mobile market with nonsense such as contra revenue, which was effectively bribing the tablet makers, which of course most were happy to take, so long as the money continued flowing their way. But it simply did not help Intel to crack the mobile market in any way, shape or form. So they're a company that wastes an awful lot of money on poor acquisitions and basically just throwing good money after bad. And it's not just AMD they need to worry about these days, because the ARM guys like Qualcomm, even Nvidia, are starting to threaten Intel's classic markets. And this is a real problem for the company. In the past few videos, I've mentioned Canard PC, which is a French magazine. It's been around for a long time and gets some very interesting news stories. Now, this was around the time that the Ryzen benchmarks were released, but it was a very interesting story on Intel in the same magazine. And thanks to a Reddit user, we have an interpretation, and there were some real gems of information on what is going on at Intel. The climate at Intel is awful, apparently. Employees are very discouraged, and some feel like they have nothing left to lose. The CEO, that's Brian Krzanich, is reducing costs so much that he's managing engineers like supermarket cashiers. And the CEO is also very impatient and eager, and keeps changing his mind about projects. Very interestingly, Intel is likely going to have a 6-month delay on 10nm, which is everything I would expect given the problems they've been having on 14. And even worse, Cannon Lake, which is their next architecture, is not expected to feature any significant architectural improvement yet again. And pretty unbelievably, Intel was basically just hoping that AMD would not be able to compete with them. It's a real hit piece on Krzanich, this one. Apparently he's a disaster, and that he won't be staying as CEO for long. And again we can see here that apparently Krzanich completely underestimated the possibility of an AMD comeback. I do find that a little bit hard to believe. But you simply never know with these companies. Intel have been in the lead for so long, and it is entirely possible that they just got so complacent about their lead and thought that they would simply never lose it again. This is also where we got confirmation that Intel was working on an MCM, integrating an Intel CPU and an AMD GPU. This was the second source mentioning this, and when I really started to take notice of the rumour. So that's one to look out for in future. So basically speaking, things not looking very good at Intel. And this week, it just got even worse, with the news that Intel's Atom C2000 chips are bricking products. And the story goes that Intel's Atom C2000 processor family has a fault that effectively bricks devices, costing the company a significant amount of money to correct. They're not telling us exactly how many chips are affected or what products are at risk, but they have had to set aside a pot of cash to deal with the problem. Now this could be pretty big and run into many millions of dollars. The money, probably not a massive thing to Intel, but all this is certainly not helping, and it does damage the brand, especially for a company like Intel, who are supposed to be flawless. There is of course no such thing as a flawless company, by far, and Intel has had similar issues in the past. For example, the Sandy Bridge chipset bug, and going way back to the Pentium's division bug. In this case, the chip contains a clock flaw, which means the system may experience an inability to boot, or may cease operation permanently. Apparently though, there is a board level workaround for the existing production stepping of the product, which resolves the issue. So some of the stuff that's already out there is likely to continue to fail. And yep, this could quite easily run into many millions of dollars of problem. And it didn't end there either, because Intel's Chief Operating Officer Kim Stephenson decided to quit on the same day. Kim Stephenson was just promoted to be the Chief Operating Officer of Intel's largest business unit. So that was her in charge of the group that manages PCs, mobile, and the Internet of Things, or the CISA. So this is all very curious. And when you read about the rumours of the high-level execs being unhappy and people quitting left, right and centre, it really does make you wonder what is going on there. And yesterday they held their investor meeting, where basically they talk about their financial outlook over the coming years, and they take a look at which markets they think are going to do well for them, that sort of thing. And one of the more interesting pieces of information was that Intel warned of lower profit margins in their key business. This is their data center business, where Intel owns 99.5% of the market, at least the x86 market. As you may be aware, nobody buys AMD's Bulldozer CPUs, nobody in the server market at least. And Intel gets away with ridiculous prices because of that. But Intel's VP of the data center group, Diane Bryant, said that data center profit margins would drop over time to the low to mid 40% range, down from the historical norms between 45 and 50%. In other words, you could be looking at data center margins dropping from 49 down to 41%, which is a rather large drop. Now the shares instantly took a hit before a slight recovery. Intel's data center business is absolutely vital to the company. Because unlike in the PC market, where most people are now at the stage where they are pretty happy with their PCs, there's not an awful lot of upgrading going on, as you probably know. The i5-2500K I bought in 2011 lasted me for 5 years. Up until that point, I was buying a new CPU every year or every other year, when the gains were there to be seen. But when Sandy Bridge came along, after that, the gains kind of disappeared. In the data center, however, it's different, as these companies will take any kind of improvement in performance per watt, simply because it's time, and time is money. But I think it's safe to say that many companies in the cloud or enterprise would not be upset to see AMD come in here and really shake up the market. But this was a bit of an eye-opener. And there could, of course, be one or two reasons for it. What was possibly the biggest news from yesterday though was that Intel confirmed that their 8th generation core is also on 14 nanometers, and also that when they finally get to 7 nanometers, the data center will be the first to use the new node. Now I'll get to that a bit later, but first of all, let's just concentrate on this 8th generation core on 14 nanometers. We remember TikTok from earlier, and we remember process architecture optimization as well, and we now have process architecture optimization. All of this on the same process. What used to take 2 years for Intel now takes 4 years. TikTok is no longer on the radar at all. Intel will be going to a new process, then a new architecture on the process, and then simply optimizing that. Now, these optimizations will be process and architecture optimizations, but it won't be a new process, and to me, this is a sign of Intel basically failing, because Intel has always been a one-trick pony, and that trick was TikTok. They're having such a terrible time of things on 14 nanometers, and 10 nanometers is so problematic that they can't even move over to it. Normally, when you shrink a process, you do it to save money. Smaller process, smaller chips. That means you can get more of them on a wafer, which means that each wafer makes you much more money. But the cost of shrinking gets more and more prohibitive, and the yields get worse and worse. It looks like Intel has hit a point here where they simply cannot afford. You think about that. Intel cannot afford to move to 10 nanometers because it would lose them money. So they are stuck doing yet another optimization and effectively hoping that yield improves on 10 nanometers. They've been hoping that yield would improve on 14 nanometers for a while too, and it didn't really materialize. But getting onto the data center being first to the new node, at the end of the 10 nanometer node, Intel is going to ditch their mobile first strategy and go with data center CPUs. The first new node for this will be 7 nanometers. And the reason for this being, when the yields are so bad, the only way to make money back on the process is by selling extremely expensive CPUs. In other words, server CPUs. How this ties in with the whole data center margins thing, you can probably figure out. The issue I'm having here with Intel is, all of this assumes that AMD are not going to be competitive. This whole thing appears to be best case scenario, where they basically expect no competition whatsoever from AMD or the ARM guys. But it also smacks of a little bit of desperation and attempting to build a moat around their final castle. The data center is so important to them that they now need to go there first before the ARM guys and AMD start to take the process leads. But this is really what it all comes down to. Intel was forever this one-trick pony, TikTok strategy company, and in the past couple of years, it has just died on them. They wasted so much money on poor acquisitions. They just threw money around at OEMs trying to bribe their way into the tablet and phone markets. Just how bad is it? It's really difficult to say. The fact is they still have well over 100,000 people working there. And when things start to go wrong, their headcount will take a haircut. And that's how they'll save money. And it's not all bad news. They do have some pretty nice technology coming, which could help them turn things around. This EMID is very interesting. It's very similar to what AMD is doing with the master plan, where they basically break up these larger monolithic dies into much smaller dies. So that will help to offset the difficulties in moving to the new nodes. So instead of having one large, poorly yielding CPU, they'd have multiple smaller CPUs basically acting as one. Very interesting to see how Intel is going about this, and it's something that I may cover in a future video. But stuff like this, Intel just not been doing enough of it recently. They've been sitting around getting rather fat on data center margins, which we now know will be taking a hit over the next few years. A lot of people ask me about the stock markets and would I buy a company or would I be selling shares in a company based on what I know. Intel is a difficult one. They're very mature stock, and I remember they were stuck around the $25 mark for years. Over the past few years, they've climbed up to 35, almost hitting 40 at one point. But for me now, it's very likely to go south. Again though, they will mitigate it by getting rid of people, and that is how a company of this size saves a lot of money. So that one, again, is a difficult one. There does not appear to be any upside though that I can see. And with Ryzen on the horizon, it's almost unfathomable that AMD won't claw back a large amount of market share, at least in the PC space, if not the data center. So Intel getting a little bit more interesting, but it's for all the wrong reasons. I'll catch you later, guys.